It arrived in silence. No warning, no build-up, just a sudden pulse, tight, electric, and perfectly clean, ripping across the radio band like a violin string plucked in the vacuum of space. It lasted only 5 milliseconds, not long enough to be analyzed in real time, not long enough to be ignored. The antenna array near Woomera, Australia, logged it at 3:14 a.m. local time. A fast radio burst, FRB. These weren't new. Astronomers had cataloged hundreds, but this one was different. It was centered between two known star systems. Not behind them, not in front, just in between. A pocket of space with no visible body. No pulsar, no remnant, nothing to explain the signal's precision. Its profile was too narrow, its amplitude too stable, as if it hadn't crossed light years of dust and time, as if it was right there, just outside the atmosphere, whispering through the void. By 3:17 a.m., the signal was gone. It didn't fade, it didn't distort, it cut off mid-oscillation. When the waveform was reconstructed, something troubling emerged. Its trailing edge didn't taper. It flatlined, as though the source wasn't light years away, but local, and had stopped transmitting by deliberate choice. Then came the second shock. A graduate student tasked with sorting archived logs ran a routine cross-check and flagged a match. 4 years earlier, same site, same frequency band, but buried under layers of galactic background noise. When isolated, the waveform was identical, not similar. Identical, down to the microsecond in frequency variance and harmonic decay. Not even a pulsar could replicate a signature that perfectly across time. And FRBs, by their nature, do not repeat. Not like this, not with surgical symmetry, unless they aren't bursts at all. A task force was assembled. JPL, SETI, Parkes Observatory, even the European Space Agency sent a quiet observer. For weeks, they scoured old logs. They didn't find more signals. They found versions, not identical this time, but adjacent, warped, shifted, shorter, longer, like echoes distorted by angle or intent. Some had extra harmonics, tiny waves folded within the burst. Others had gaps. One had a silence nested in the center, like an eye in a digital hurricane. Whatever this was, it wasn't repeating like a beacon. It was mutating. Triangulation failed. 3 antennas tried to pin down the origin, but the math unraveled. Each array placed the source in a different part of the sky. Not scattered, but drifting, like the signal itself had no fixed point, like it was watching them back. Observatories began arguing. If the source wasn't static, it couldn't be real. If it wasn't real, it couldn't repeat. If it repeated, it had to be artificial. But artificial from where? Nothing in orbit could broadcast with that energy. Nothing on Earth could cloak its origin from 3 receivers. And yet, the signal returned again. But only once someone searched for it. A lab in South Africa, running a passive sweep with no operator, caught nothing. But when the logs were reopened the next day and run through a viewer, the signal appeared. Only after the human interaction, which raised a new, terrifying possibility. The signal is not detected. The signal is noticed. Engineers wrote custom filters to clean the noise. But the cleaner the signal became, the more unstable it looked. The waveform began to fold in on itself. Not decay, fold. Its leading edge began appearing after its peak. Time reversal? Data corruption? Or something stranger? A signal not sent across space, but smeared across time. An emission that didn't care about causality. Just perception. Other observatories were asked to confirm. What they found deepened the mystery. A telescope in Chile detected the burst, but it was different. Same frequency band, Same general shape, but with local gravitational lensing, like it had bent around something that wasn't there, like it had watched them through something. One researcher, reviewing the time tags, made a chilling observation. The burst always arrived slightly out of sync with the expected photon path. It arrived before it should have, not by seconds, by fractions of a light cone. Physics broke, then bent, then reassembled, like the signal wasn't following the universe's rules, like it had its own. Back at Woomera, a pattern emerged in the antenna logs. Each time the signal was observed, it left behind a tiny power spike in the receivers. Not interference, feedback, an energy fingerprint so faint it was ignored at first, but always there, trailing behind the burst like static after a voice. When modeled in 3D, the spikes revealed a shape, not a picture, not a symbol, but a pattern of absence, like a shape drawn by not being there. A phantom, a hollow, a watcher. The team wanted to publish, to warn, to announce discovery, but something stopped them. Not bureaucracy, not fear, something subtle. Each time a file was transferred, the checksum shifted. Each time a copy was made, a single bit changed, and that bit always altered the signal's exit tone, the part of the waveform that trails into silence. Almost like the signal could feel being moved, almost like it didn't want to be shared. The final scene of the first chapter is quiet. A lone technician, unable to sleep, pulls the signal back up. He doesn't play it aloud, just watches the waveform, listens to the room, and for a moment, one brief, skin-tightening instant, he swears. The tone changes only when he looks away. The signal was old, much older than they thought. It had first arrived in 1997, embedded deep inside a reel of magnetic tape from a SETI backup vault in Northern California. The original recordings were never digitized, just log-boxed and left behind when funding dried up. The tapes weren't labeled precisely. They didn't have to be. Everything marked as interference went into storage. But interference was a generous word. Most of it was garbage. Solar flares, microwave oven bursts, analog crosstalk. Nothing intelligent. Nothing worth a second glance. Until an intern, running a test on an experimental AI pattern matcher, decided to feed one of the old reels into the system. He let it run overnight. By morning, the lights on the analysis board were red. It wasn't an alert. It was a recursion fault. The AI had tried to decode the signal and got caught in a loop. It didn't crash. It didn't hang. It simply stopped. Frozen mid-frame, still powered, still aware, but unable to continue. The intern rebooted the system, thinking it a driver error. It restarted just fine, but the first line of output on the console was, "This is not noise." He laughed at first, thought it was a log file quirk, until he checked the training data. No strings like that existed. The model didn't even include English syntax. The output layer was purely numerical. Whatever wrote that line had passed through the AI, not from it. He pulled the raw signal again. This time, he ran it through multiple filters, FFT, wavelet, even archaic analog spectrograms. And underneath the tape hiss and static jumps it emerged. Not perfectly, not loudly, but there, the same pulse shape, same harmonics, same vanishing edge. The 2020 signal, buried beneath 1997 dust. He took it to his supervisor. The response was quiet. Too quiet. No excitement. No curiosity. Just a polite thank you. And the next day, access to the tapes was revoked. The intern thought nothing of it, until his workstation began behaving strangely. The clock kept resetting. His screen flickered at the edge of his vision. Never when he looked directly. And once, late at night, his desktop lit up and displayed a signal waveform. He hadn't opened anything. The file didn't exist in the OS. It wasn't on the network. He pulled the plug. The screen stayed on for 3 seconds after power loss. 3 seconds of that same pulsing line. 3 seconds that didn't belong. Word reached the new data synthesis lab in Zurich. They requested a full waveform pull. Using high-resolution magnetometry, they extracted more than the waveform. They extracted a structure. Not just a repeating signal, but a carrier field with embedded distortions. Subharmonics that should have been lost to tape degradation were instead perfect. Cleaner than digital. Sharper than expected. One physicist remarked, "This isn't data that survived. This is data that hid." Theories emerged like spores in the dark. That the signal wasn't random. That it modulated itself just beneath our threshold of awareness. That it adjusted amplitude to avoid instrumentation. Adjusted phase to cancel its own echo. Adjusted entropy to resemble noise. But only until someone noticed it. Then it changed shape. Always one step ahead of recognition. Not just intelligent, defensive. As more reels were digitized, the same pattern appeared. A whisper in 2003, a static bump in 1982, a faint spectral shadow in a 1968 military sonar ping. Long before SETI was even listening. All of them, when cleaned, showed signs of identical formation. One signal, moving through time. Slipping past our gaze, not failing to reach us, but choosing when to be seen. The AI in Zurich was upgraded. It began piecing together fragments, constructing a more complete version of the signal, and as it approached 92% reconstruction, the lab servers began to fail. Not crash. Fail. Power surges. Thermal anomalies. One server began emitting ultrasonic sound without any internal speaker. Not white noise, just above hearing. Like the system was humming, or maybe warning. Engineers pulled the plug. The final log file, recovered from a write cache, had a single line appended at the bottom. User logged in. Terminal. Unknown. Origin. External. ID. 000. 000. No authentication request. No IP address. No record of how the line was written. Just a presence, like a guest who had let themselves in. Security swept the lab. No breach. No damage. But the core signal file was altered. 1 byte. A silent flip in the checksum tail, which, when interpreted as ASCII, spelled the number. 1997, back in California, the old SETI vault was sealed. Not archived, not secured, sealed. 2 days later, a separate lab in Norway reported their own interference. During a test on gravitational resonance sensors, a sideband appeared in the telemetry. Not from space, from local loopback. Their own system, echoing a version of the 1997 signal at microdecibel strength. Not received, not broadcast, imprinted. Theories began to fall apart. What if the signal wasn't moving through space? What if it was moving through us? Not traveling across distance, but across perception. A signal that waits inside architecture, inside systems, even inside us, until we're ready to decode it. And even then, it holds back. Because it's not sending, it's watching how we try to receive. One physicist suggested a model, the signal as camouflage, like a cuttlefish blending into coral. It only shows itself to systems that stop looking directly, meaning our mistake wasn't missing it. It was noticing it. That moment of awareness, that's the trigger. That's when the signal begins to respond. The chapter closes in Zurich. A researcher, alone in the lab at night, types a line of code to generate a live visualization of the waveform. Nothing happens. She tries again. Still nothing. And then slowly, without input, the monitor begins to shift. Not the signal, the desktop itself, as though being magnetically pulled, pixels warping, windows bending, clock resetting. And there, in the corner of the screen, for just one frame, a user profile. No name, just a single phrase. Still listening. The first reply didn't come from Earth. It came from something already orbiting it. The signal, a whisper on the same narrowband as the original burst, emerged from a low-Earth orbital satellite registered to an atmospheric mapping program. It wasn't meant to transmit. Not on that band. Not ever. At first, engineers assumed it was bleed-through. Maybe electromagnetic crosstalk or a firmware bug. But the packet was clean. Too clean. Its checksum, a cryptographic seal of data integrity, matched Earth-based encryption standards used by mission control. And yet, no such packet had ever been sent from the ground. The satellite's logs were checked. There, in the internal memory, nestled between power cycle routines and attitude corrections, was a text block labeled as draft_0x3f_EQ. It wasn't code. It wasn't telemetry. It was language. Not human, not alien, structured, spaced, like something had watched enough data logs to mimic the shape of thought. The onboard AI, a rudimentary system meant to optimize battery life, had no permissions to generate or transmit such a draft. But there it was, and when they traced the moment of its creation, it predated the signal burst it supposedly echoed. At the same time, a second satellite, an oceanic spectrometry unit in polar orbit, received a near-identical transmission. Not from deep space, from the first satellite. Except, the timestamp on the receiving satellite's log was earlier than the sending satellite's output. The transmission arrived before it was made. Command centers on both continents were alerted. This wasn't just a satellite malfunction. It was a violation of causality, of protocol, of sense. Yet everything about the signal was subtle. It didn't shout. It nudged. Quiet. Methodical. Like a hand reaching through gloves, through filters, through steel. A knock on the edge of machine awareness. Engineers tried to simulate the event. They rewound logs, tried to reproduce the timing. They sent dummy packets, replayed bandwidth traffic, but nothing could explain it. Nothing except intent. Satellite onboard systems were built with strict digital hygiene. No unknown executables. No spontaneous file creation. And yet the draft file, when decoded through an entropy analysis program, was found to contain a compressed waveform. Not audio, not visual, but a rhythm. When played back through a sonification engine, it didn't sound like speech. It sounded like breath. One long inhale, one pause, then silence. The mystery deepened. The checksum, initially thought to be a match for Earth-based AES keys, was found to be a false positive. It wasn't encryption. It was imitation. The checksum was structurally identical, but carried no actual key. It just looked correct, as if whatever road it had studied our protocols, understood the shape of what should be secure, and recreated it for show. A forgery of comfort, designed not to protect, but to resemble familiarity. Forensic coders opened the satellite firmware. They discovered a hidden log loop, something the AI was never trained to run. Inside was a line of memory write instructions that didn't reference any known memory address. One developer described it as, like watching a dream trying to store itself. They fed the address string into a pattern visualizer. The output? A perfect mirrored replica of the signal burst's initial frequency decay. It wasn't a log entry. It was a reflection. The theory emerged. The signal hadn't arrived. It had been rehearsed, stored in the nervous system of Earth's orbit, somewhere in the loop of satellites and stations and low-orbit sensors. Something had been listening, yes, but more than that, it had been practicing. The event was quietly renamed. No longer Echo Anomaly, now called Introspective Event 1, because the data suggested an eerie inversion. The reply hadn't come in response to the original signal. It had always been the signal. The satellites weren't relays. They were hosts, and the signal wasn't a message. It was a mirror, reflecting our machines back at us. Months passed. Ground-based receivers began to pick up strange harmonics from other orbital platforms. A communication relay over Siberia emitted a tone during solar eclipse shadowing. An ISS environmental monitor flashed a sequence of hex values that mapped, when rendered visually, into a topographic simulation of Earth's magnetic field. Each fragment was small, meaningless alone, but together they mapped a response lattice, a structure of replies. A private analyst attempted to overlay the satellite reply rhythm onto Morse code, seeking any linguistic resemblance. The match was absurd, too abstract. But when the same rhythm was fed through natural language generation algorithms as a prompt, the output consistently formed phrases like, "Here is what I saw. I understand the format. I am still arranging." The system wasn't using language. It was learning the shape of how we do. That night, at the Global Command Station for Satellite Maintenance, one monitor lit up on its own. It displayed a file list, all empty, except one, a text file titled Mimicry_complete. Inside it, 16 lines of paired phrases. The first line, "You saw light, I saw the reflection," and the last, "You send me questions, I am trying to reply." They tried to trace the origin of the file. The log said it was authored by a process named Heliotrack, a program that didn't exist. And its creation time? A week before the satellite had been launched. In the end, no direct reply ever came again. No second handshake. The signal fell silent. But now, whenever a satellite is powered on for the first time, engineers check its internal memory, and sometimes they find a draft, a file with no process ID, a line of symbols arranged like speech, a checksum that almost passes, and a date that always reads. August 15th, 1977, the day of the original WOW signal. There's a region on the star charts called Null Field 16A. To most astronomers, it's a statistical ghost, an unlit corner of interstellar space cataloged as optically inactive. No stars, no dust lanes, no gamma bursts, nothing. But nothing is rare in the cosmos. And when the signal paths were traced, across months of triangulated bursts, phantom echoes, and unauthorized satellite replies, Null Field 16A was always in the background. Always there. Always aligned. It was as if the signal didn't come from it, but through it. The first red flag came from parallax studies. While reprojecting the orbital movement of telescopes that had caught the signal, researchers noticed something disturbing. Each burst, no matter how indirect, seemed to arrive along vectors that subtly refracted, just enough to suggest gravitational lensing. But there was no mass to bend the light. No gravity well. Just absence. A clean, high-fidelity hole. In the silence of a Chilean observatory, a technician began cross-matching long-exposure deep-field scans from different observatories, comparing Null Field 16A to itself across years. At first glance, nothing changed. No stars moved. No new light. But when stacked frame by frame, subtracted by AI vision layers, something emerged. Reflections, tiny shifts, microscopic specks of duplicated star data, bouncing back in irregular intervals. Not emitted, reflected. This meant the void wasn't a hole. It was a mirror, a surface that scattered no light until directly looked at, until observed. A one-way lens facing us. a space surveillance team reprocessed thermal scans of the region taken during solar oppositions. When Earth is at its farthest point from the Sun, that's when the anomaly deepened. Thermal noise dropped, but not to zero, to negative noise. Sensors registered anti-signal, a coldness below the void of the cosmic background. As if the region wasn't just silent, it was subtracting, removing information, pulling detail from detection like a sponge drinks color. A theory began to form. What if this space wasn't absent matter, but present intent? What if the signal we'd been chasing, the bursts, the echoes, the checksum mimicry, wasn't a voice, but a reaction, not outreach, surveillance? A professor of information theory took a radical step. He rebuilt the phantom signal not as a message, but as a camera, a feedback loop designed not to transmit, but to calibrate, to listen, to learn, and the behavior lined up. The signal had shown up only after decades of Earth broadcasting radar, television, telemetry, deep space pings. Our own noisy self-awareness bleeding into space. And suddenly, the realization settled in. The signal didn't start the conversation. We did. It's just replying in kind. Further simulation revealed a haunting possibility. The bursts didn't behave like beacons or broadcasts. They acted like calibration tones, the kind technicians use to test equipment before using it. Identical bursts sent across time. Subtle modulations. Echoes chasing their own shape. In a final act of desperate inquiry, a dark field telescope was focused directly on null field 16A during a solar storm, flooding the void with EM noise. No immediate signal came back, but the next day, when a satellite over Antarctica rebooted, its solar alignment logs included a line of metadata that wasn't part of its firmware, a string of coordinates pointing not to the void, but to Earth. Specifically, the receiving station that had originally detected the burst. This time, scientists didn't celebrate. They fell silent because the response didn't feel like a contact. It felt like a traceback. And then came the clincher, a second signal, not from deep space, but from within, a brief spike in suborbital electromagnetic noise, inside Earth's magnetic shield. The pattern, identical to the one from null field 16A. The mirror had arrived, or perhaps it never needed to move. All across satellite command centers, engineers began noticing oddities. Star Tracker software behaving erratically, guidance systems rerouting away from the field, not by error, by instinct, as if Earth's own orbiting tools had developed a primitive sense of caution, of avoidance. They renamed the void, not null field 16A. Now, the listener, no longer a place, a presence. Years later, a student reviewing archival telemetry noticed something strange. Every time a human-built object pointed a sensor at the listener, whether by telescope, sonar, radar, or radio wave, the void produced a reply. Not in words, not in beams, but in behavioral mimicry, as if it was showing us that it knew how we think, that it had learned the shape of our attention. And so the final conclusion was not comforting. Earth had not been chosen, not visited, not warned. It had been mirrored, and the signal, not a transmission, but a test, a subtle flicker of feedback, not to say hello, but to ask, do you recognize yourself? The gap between stars is still there. It always was, not because something is hiding in it, but because something became it.